Everyone. This is Mark Nadal. I'd like to welcome Blue Sky, Nadir, and Aaron to this lively debate and discussion on peers versus minors. We are going to try and get as technical as possible and to throw some punches back and forth, metaphorically speaking, to get to the root and heart of the Web3 issue.
Yeah, so peer versus minors. I've seen a number of debates in distributed systems questions where there are some people who come from this perspective of, I want a pure peer-to-peer system. All of the peers should be equal. There should be no difference and no node that is like the super node and gets extra powers. On the flip side, we've seen a lot of federated systems that have a strict two-tier system. You are a server or you are a client, and the servers can pass messages between each other, and the clients must be a client of a specific server and are very much tied to that server for their identity and their operation within the network. The thought behind this discussion was, is this something that is fundamental to the nature of computing and we're always going to have these tiered infrastructures? Or is it possible to both leverage machines that may have more power? Right. So as I was saying, can we build pure peer-to-peer systems that are reliable, or are we going to need to have some centralized service like Twitter to make sure that those servers are always present and it just doesn't randomly drop us out completely?
So I'm going to start framing things because there's three people on the panel here. I come from the peer-to-peer space and will be pushing very strongly that if it's not your machine, it's not your peer-to-peer with the gun protocol. Aaron actually comes from being a security engineer at Twitter, but he's challenged me that full nodes or minor nodes have a place. And then Nadir, to speak on your behalf, but I'll have you jump in, comes from an in-between position at the Graph, which does indexing for these decentralized blockchain or protocols. So Nadir, why don't you jump in and introduce kind of your fit to this equation before we kick off the actual.
Yeah, I mean, I'm more of I have more of the position that it's like, it depends. I think that just like any technology, everything has its place and it has its positives and negatives, and it has its strengths and weaknesses. And I feel like that's kind of more my stance. I think that what we're going to talk about here today, we're essentially talking about how we're storing decentralized data and the different protocols and systems that we can use to do that. And I think I'm going to be kind of just speaking to my experience and my thoughts around why I think certain things are good for certain things and certain things are better for other things.
So for me, the thesis statement is that there are now enough phones in the world to power all of Facebook by the people, for the people, and of the people. So Aaron, I'm going to kick back and say we don't need the disproportionate capital in data centers for this to work out and us to get a peer-to-peer world.
Yeah, so I think that you went to sort of the right place with this question of indexing. There are a lot of things we can definitely do on our phones. We have been using email for years in ways that work in a pretty distributed fashion. If my phone has an email and I sign my message and I try to send the message to you, the only thing I really need from a service is to look up, okay, what IP address is your phone at? Where do I actually send this traffic to? And that's relatively cheap and can be done with a distributed hash table. The place where I find that it is very useful to have centralized large servers is when I start running big queries and I want to do something like build my timeline. Now I'm pulling a lot of information from a lot of different people that all has to be aggregated, and different people are going to have similar and overlapping interests. So it makes sense to say, I'm going to have one computer that's got a lot of RAM and a lot of disk and a lot of resources that is going to build these indexes in very useful ways. And then we can all amortize them by having lots of phones hit the same indexes that have those working sets in memory so that you get that kind of buttery smooth, fast performance that we're used to on the internet today.
Nadir, do you have some stats? Oh, sorry, go.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of curious. I would love to ping. I'd love to pick your brain a little bit here in just a second. But I mean, one of the reasons that people use the graph protocol, and this kind of hopefully relates to this conversation quite a bit, is that they have all of their data that's obviously been written during the course of days, weeks, months, and years, or whatever, into these blockchain networks. But it's not easy to query this data because if you hit a smart contract at a certain point in time, you're limited by the functions that are available within that contract, but you're also limited to the data that's available within that point in time as well. So if you want to do any of the types of queries that we typically need for a real world application, like he mentioned, like Aaron mentioned, like we're used to, something like where I want to get a friend's list, or I want to search, I want to do full text search here on Twitter. These are really complex queries that cannot be done directly on chain. So there needed to be some indexing mechanism where we take all this data, we put it in a database, we create an API layer on top of it, and people can then read this data. One of the networks that we're looking to support in the future is something similar to Gun. It's called Ceramic Network, and it kind of does something similar to that. So I guess the question I have is this: if I was to build, an application right now with Gun, how would I enable the types of queries that might be necessary for the types of applications that developers want to build today? How would that be done?
Yeah, so there's a couple pieces here. First, just to answer your question directly, because there's these non-blockchain systems like Gun, BitTorrent, and others, the default way you interact with the peer-to-peer database, with the decentralized system, is to make queries. And those queries can be anything from a key value lookup, like you might see in Redis, all the way up to doing GraphQL type things on top of a few other layers, as well as everything in between. In the case of Gun, we support both GraphQL queries on top of our underlying query system. And that underlying query system looks like graph traversal through Redis key values. I don't want to spend too much time on that because that's not the point of the discussion, though, but I want to kind of bring back to this idea of old school scaling with BitTorrent. It's only in the last decade people have started to associate decentralized with necessarily being blockchain. And you're correct. Each new block has the transaction inside of it. So if you want to get your total account balance, you're going to have to scan back through some of the blocks. And a lot of that indexing of what information is in your wallet is indexed by either a federated system or a centralized system. And I think that poses an existential threat to the future of decentralization if we keep on focusing on that approach. So just to end my last comment here, as I'm swinging a punch towards decentralization as being more BitTorrent style, we used to be able to stream 40% of the world's traffic between 2008 and 2011 for doing big media queries called movies. And now we can hardly handle floats in a blockchain at a couple transactions per second.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on which, blockchain you're talking about, though, for sure. I mean, you definitely have some of the older school chains with the original consensus mechanisms that kind of laid the groundwork for some of the more scalable stuff that we're seeing today. Yeah, if you talk about Ethereum and you kind of try to compare Ethereum to a traditional high scale, high throughput database, it's not going to be a good comparison because they're kind of used for different reasons. I think a better comparison might be between something like Gun, Ceramic, ThreadDB, those sorts of things, because I typically would not use Ethereum or even any blockchain for something that I would use, a traditional database for.
Aaron, I'm winning somebody over to my side. Give me a bite.
So I guess my question is, we've seen companies like MetaMask that have started to produce APIs that are convenient. So most of the time when someone goes to look at an NFT and says, who owns this NFT? They're not going to some node that's got the whole blockchain and scanning the whole thing. They're simply calling an API to a commercial service that says, yes, this is the particular person who owns that. And if someone like MetaMask decides to ban your NFT because they think it doesn't follow their terms of service, they're perfectly welcome to do that. And lots of apps will no longer see that you have that, despite the fact that it's still in the chain. So if we have to put indexes on top of things and we have to trust those indexes, what is that actually buying us over just trusting that company to keep an index of who owns which thing rather than having an index on top of a blockchain?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And it's a good point to kind of to talk to. I think everyone remembers that post that Emcee made a couple of months ago that was kind of diving into this exact conversation. And the main talking point, or one of the main talking points, was the fact that a lot of the applications that we see today are kind of relying on these centralized RPC nodes. So when you talk to a blockchain, you need to have some way to communicate, just similar to how we might think of like an HTTP endpoint or a GraphQL endpoint in a traditional web application. Instead, we have these RPC nodes. So you can run your own. You can run your own node. You can have your own endpoint. You can talk to that, and that node is connected to the network, and you can kind of assume that the data is obviously reliable. But when you're relying on one of these centralized services, you have a couple of problems there. One is that you have a single point of failure. So a lot of these are actually just running on traditional centralized infrastructures like Google and AWS. So if US East 1 goes down, then the RPC endpoint goes down and you no longer have communication. That's one problem. Another problem is that, like you mentioned, you're assuming that the data that they're serving you is correct. How do you verify that that's true? And again, like that's literally the stuff that we have built and we're working on at the Graph. We have a decentralized protocol that allows developers to kind of describe the data that they want to be stored, saves that within a decentralized network where we have network participants that stake their tokens, and this is kind of why tokens would be useful for something like this, to run an indexing server. And the indexer is essentially kind of running a piece of software infrastructure that is accepting these APIs that we call subgraphs for developers to deploy. The subgraph defines the data, defines the network, smart contracts, defines the actual network where we want to store this data. And then after the data is stored, it's verified by the network to be actually the proper data. And if an indexer is actually storing and indexing and making data available that is not correct, then they actually are penalized. So there is a incentive mechanism built into the network to prevent bad actors from serving incorrect data.
So this is very much an economic argument. I go to some server and say, hey, is this the current value? And the server responds, I bet you that it is. And if I'm wrong, you get a cash prize for proving me wrong. And now some percentage of users, rather than just trusting the answers, can go validate them and win the cash prizes and thus be compensated for their auditing of the system. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, there's a financial incentive to not store and serve the wrong data. But there's also, all of this stuff is done on chain. Anyone running one of these nodes has all of their history of the things that they've done and the indexers that they've run and the queries that they've served and all of this stuff. So you can kind of use a combination of reputation along with, whatever other types of investigation that you might do into an indexer to choose like which indexer to use for your application.
While the economics and balancing that out is a whole discussion on its own, I actually want to just say, hey, let's clear that and give it a quick thumbs up pass. I still have a challenge of why does this not turn into Gmail? We know that SMTP with email is federated. Over time, you get Hotmail, Yahoo Mail, and then ultimately Gmail, and they come in and they monopolize the market. And despite the fact the protocol underlying is federated, you get a monopolization that conglomerates and accumulates over time. How do you prevent that future, even if you happen to get all the economics right?
I'm not sure if I'm understanding this correctly. I mean, I get the argument for sure, but which protocols in particular do you think that are threatened or prone to kind of these types of situations?
Well, all proof of stake, generally speaking. I know a lot of people probably disagree with me, but I'm the hot bucket here making the not your machine, not your peer-to-peer statements and ultimatums, is I see Wells Fargo, Chase, JP Morgan as all being a type of proof of stake. There's investors in the public stock market that can pull their money out if trust is lost. Unfortunately, governments bail them out. But we already have this capitalism system using dollars that leads to this proof of stake where these people ought to be beholden to and can lose or be punished based off of regulation or a stock market dump. I don't see how anything from Solana to Ethereum to any proof of stake, and to some degree even proof of work, but let's save that for another time, is necessarily making the system more egalitarian or more democratic. It's still capital intensive miners that have access to the network and create these types of centralizations around their endpoints.
So yeah, this could turn into a whole conversation in and of itself, a proof of stake, versus other I guess consensus mechanisms. You mentioned proof of work. I think obviously no consensus mechanism is perfect. I think that we're evolving, and you've seen just like technology has evolved over the past 30 or 40 years, we're starting to see blockchain technology evolve and improve. And I would say that proof of stake to me is a big improvement over proof of work. And then we're also seeing other new consensus mechanisms being tried out. And currently, I would say, most widely used and quote unquote like state of the art that people are moving to kind of address environmental concerns, along with all the other things you need necessary to kind of run these types of networks, is definitely proof of stake. Now, is it prone to, I would say, like you mentioned, banks or people with large amounts of money running or owning a large percentage of the network? Yes, but at the same time, it doesn't prevent everyone from participating in the network. You don't have to have $1 million or even $1,000 to be someone that is participating in proof of stake. You can actually pool together with other people to be a part of that. And I don't think that anything around Web3 or decentralization is kind of meant to keep any particular person out due to the nature of it being permissionless. I think it's more about enabling everyone to participate. So just like you have a lot of the traditional financial instruments for raising capital that only allow the top 1% to participate, you're seeing that flipped on its head with these tokenized protocols, tokenized DAOs that enable people to not only invest early, but to actually gain ownership just by being a builder and helping actually bootstrap those projects and those communities. So again, I guess my main take is that it's less about keeping certain people out and more about allowing more people in.
Strongly agree, though isn't the permission oftentimes based off of regulatory concern? Because after the stock market crash of 1928 and one of the other ones, it's government comes in and says only the top people can own this, and it's predictably going to be the case, regardless of how well the algorithms work, that same sort of regulation is going to come in at the crypto side because of, I forget, the orange law that says anything that goes up in value is going to be considered and treated as securities. And we can't battle a government without lobbying, even if we have the right algorithms. So to slightly move the conversation, but please reply to this, both of you, I kind of want to focus the discussion on, let's say, Africa, Middle East, or third world countries where people may not have hardware to run a miner here, but they might have a phone to participate in this network. Wouldn't it be better for the banking system or the decentralized system to be moving towards systems that can be running off of the phones directly rather than relying upon a Coinbase endpoint?
I guess my question there would be, what is the freedom that you are afraid of losing? If we have a world where everything is peer-to-peer and their whole financial system is phone-to-phone, versus one where the phones are essentially clients and a large number of servers are acting as miners and providing the network in exchange for some amount of the compensation. I don't necessarily see a 2% of every transaction goes to the miners to run the network as that different than 2% of every transaction goes to Visa or MasterCard because they've decided to run the network. What is the freedom that you think you are losing here?
Nadir, do you want to go, or I'm happy to jump in?
No, go ahead, jump in.
Well, so for me, I think I don't know if the question is targeted at me because as soon as there's fees and transactions, there's always going to be middlemen. And the whole point of Bitcoin has peer-to-peer cash had peer-to-peer in it. But the reality is I can't go up to somebody on the street and just pay them without being connected to the network, let alone the internet. And so there is a difference. I love Bitcoin, just to be clear. But there is a difference between what I'm arguing is peer-to-peer and what is decentralized. You can have decentralization of ownership, but not have peer-to-peer interactivity, or even peer-to-peer payments, or even peer-to-peer data sync or profile loading. So the freedom I'm concerned about, there's multiple layers. So I don't want to get too off topic. Everything from the regulation standpoint of a government treating a token as security. Now you can't use those tokens as a layperson because you have to be a qualified investor, or whether that be, let's say, a second tier when you're in a different country where you don't have the hardware to run or participate in those networks if you don't necessarily care about the security side of them or the investment standpoint. And there's a third tier, which is, well, wait a second, even if I'm in a country that has all those things, I'm allowed to do that, and I have access to hardware and compute. Well, what if I still want to walk up to somebody in the street and just over Bluetooth, sneaker net style, help a protest continue? Because if Russia or Turkey or Iran cuts off the internet, well, guess what? You don't have the cell towers to peer-to-peer transfer the protest and keep on spreading the word to organize and coordinate. This is a Burning Man style. This is peer-to-peer. That's peer-to-peer to me. That has better censorship resistance ability, whether that be regulatory, whether that be financial, or whether that be freedom of speech. So that's a huge gaping spectrum I've just brought up. I'll leave it to you to hone in on what's the most interesting.
So I'm curious, I'm wondering, I know a lot of the reasons that a lot of these tokens exist is around incentivizing the network to exist in the first place. How would you see, well, I'm actually curious, like how you might be planning to fund, gun. Is it something that like is going to be making money in a certain way, or is it more like, yeah, I'm just kind of curious, like what is the plan to actually keep the network running 50 years from now or even 20 years from now?
The rebel here, I'm not doing it for tokens and stuff, just to be very clear. The interesting thing I want to start with is just because it was asked. In 2021 alone, just that annual year, we did 500 million downloads. That roughly equated to around 60 million monthly active users. So if we're talking about longevity or adoption or incentivization of getting people to use peer-to-peer systems, they don't even know they're using these systems because it's so easy. There is no gas or some sort of fee or additional wallet you have to download. There's none of those barriers. It just works. And I'm still working on getting things to scale, but it scales as a result of not having to have everything running through a centralized block miner that's rotating, whether it's rotating or not. So there's very, very different mechanics. Now, how does my team get funded? I have had to raise venture capital funding to get Gun off the ground, and that will continue. And there's just, in general, commercial use cases for Gun that I push, but that is distinct from my passion for creating this type of open revolution that doesn't require gas or fees or somebody else's miner that you have to connect into the internet that could get shut down during protests or riots. No, I want this peer-to-peer thing, and that's what I'm shooting for. So hopefully,
yeah. No, that makes sense. I mean, I guess my question was kind of around longevity and like funding and all that stuff, mainly because the reason that a lot of people are kind of like excited about some of these protocols is having to do with maybe the tokenomics that enable a network of computers to kind of work together and be self-sustaining, similarly to how we might think of how in the past we would need a team of 20 or 30 folks at AWS to kind of manage this infrastructure that we then use to build upon. Instead, we have like a network of computers that is running, a protocol that is obviously built by developers as well. But once it's up and running and people are kind of running these nodes, it's self-sustaining. And to kind of go back though more around the place that I think that these peer-to-peer networks fit in, I don't think it's kind of a question of one or the other. Like, I don't think that if we make peer-to-peer networks like Gun.js successful, that they're going to replace blockchains or vice versa. Instead, I think like each has their own place in the tech stack. I think like if you look at what we had 10 years ago versus look at what we had today, yes, certain databases like replaced the predecessors, but more so than other, we just have more tools and more ways to build stuff. So if I wanted to build a messaging app that I wanted to be censorship resistant, that I knew was going to be used in protests in Ukraine or in Lebanon, then I probably wouldn't go for a centralized tech stack when something like Gun existed. But if I wanted to build a financial primitive for, I don't know, some new application that I needed to do fundraising with, or I have some new protocol that I wanted to build, I might use a blockchain for that. So I think it's less about, is this better than that, and more about like, where does this fit into the tech stack?
That was a knockout punch. You're right. Gun does not do banking, and you should not do banking on Gun because you're likely going to get your money stolen as a result of double spend exploits. So good point, Nadir. Thanks.
Let's bring Mike Staub in for a question, and anybody else who would like to pose a question, please feel free to request to speak, and feel free to introduce yourself and make a short question for the whole entire panel or a specific panelist. Please go ahead, Mike Staub.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Sure can.
We can hear you.
Yeah, I'm really liking this discussion. Just a couple points I wanted to bring up related to what was discussed. First of all, one of the consensus mechanisms that's very interesting to me is proof of burn, which is basically a virtualized proof of work where the miners are just programs that can run on your phone and mint these NFTs. So it's sort of a nice, strength of proof of work and proof of stake. So I would look into that. Also, Mark is correct. Like just last week, BlockFi had to pay a $100 million fine to the SEC for their DeFi product. So regulation is coming, and I think it's going to get pretty serious. So we can't avoid that. And then one more point I wanted to make is the peer-to-peer point Mark made is also correct about internet blackouts and taking off decentralized networks by shutting off the power to the internet. One thing I hope to see in the future is satellite internet options. And it's going to be a lot harder, but still possible, to take people off those networks. And so, yeah, just some food for thought for people that are interested in these topics. A great conversation.
Yeah, I haven't really heard of proof of burn, and that's interesting. I know that there's so many interesting consensus mechanisms that are being tested and tried out. I wonder what it's going to look like maybe 5 years from now.
Yeah, I would look into what the Koinos team is doing. They were the guys that did the Steemit blockchain. They learned a ton, and now they're doing their own modular blockchain, so that basically everything except for the core services are implemented as smart contracts. So you don't have this like hard fork problem, which becomes like a political nightmare. I mean, just look at Ethereum, right? So they're I think kind of blazing the trail into these new, this new consensus mechanism and new blockchain style that's trying to find the best of both worlds without compromising on key areas.
So I agree a lot with what Nadir is saying, that for financial stuff, you're going to have to use a blockchain. Yeah, you can't use Gun for that. But I do want to challenge this idea. Most of all of the other blockchains compared to Bitcoin are all fighting for this future of smart contracts and universal computability. If we're talking about money, how is the discussion anything other than Bitcoin?
Well, you mentioned smart contracts. I think that as a developer, there's a couple of things that I'm kind of interested in around, I guess, networks that are not Bitcoin. And I know that Bitcoin is now having more of these like primitives. I think I saw stacks is something that you can build with on Bitcoin. Well, I would say first and foremost, whether or not like you or me or anyone like believes this or doesn't believe this, there is a narrative that has some merit to it around, I guess, the environmental impact without even talking about any of the actual technological differences maybe of other networks. And a lot of people just don't want to be building on Bitcoin because of that when there are more environmentally friendly consensus mechanisms that are out there. So like some people will just not touch Bitcoin because of that. In addition to that, like Ethereum has had smart contracts in the EVM for a long time before Bitcoin enabled any of that functionality. So you have this whole ecosystem of Solidity engineers that are able to now build across dozens of different blockchains. And the transaction costs on Ethereum might be high, but on something like Avalanche or some of these other newer networks, the transaction costs can be in the fractions of a penny to like a penny. So that's kind of why like you're now seeing this fragmentation, and you have like one network that's good at this thing and you have another network that's good at that thing. So like when a new developer comes into the ecosystem, they kind of look around and they're like, okay, this is where I can get started building today. And that's kind of why I think, in my opinion, you have this fragmentation.
Let's take Ukraine. If we're trying to help people in Ukraine, since it's politically very important and hot right now, are we going to be sending them Ethereum, smart contract, Solana, or are we going to be sending them Bitcoin? Kind of give me your take on how you help resistance.
Well, I just met with the founder yesterday in Lebanon. I can't speak for Ukraine. I don't really know anyone there. I have been keeping up with the the political situation there. But yeah, I met with the founder yesterday from Lebanon. They live in Lebanon, and they've experienced the inflation and all of the political and other unrest over the last like 2 years. And they're trying to build out a bunch of different things, but they all have to do with like fundraising and enabling the creators in Lebanon to essentially kind of make money using art and things like that. And they've decided to build on an EVM compatible chain because they want to be able to have primitives like ERC20 and ERC721. So for them to kind of build out the applications that they need, the primitives just don't exist on other networks right now. Also, like if you want to send someone money and they're not making $1,000, but maybe they're making like $50, then it doesn't make sense to send them money on Ethereum or Bitcoin because the transaction cost is going to eat up a large percentage of that. But if you send them money on Solana, it's going to be less than like 1/3 of 1 cent. So you can send someone $5 and it makes a lot of sense. So if you're out of a job in Lebanon and you're I don't know, let's say you've been working at like a retail store or something, and instead you've been on your computer the last 6 months and you learn how to do some design stuff, and you pick up this gig where you're kind of like creating, I don't know, like logos or something, you can easily jump into a Discord and a DAO and create, something for someone and get paid your $50 or $100. And I don't think the average person would want to get paid on a network that's eating up a large percentage of those funds. Also, if you get paid on a network that is EVM compatible, you can get paid in a stable currency that doesn't fluctuate. So Bitcoin does fluctuate, does not fluctuate as much as the currency in Lebanon, but it does fluctuate. I think a lot of people in these countries that have very high inflation rates appreciate the ability to bank on a currency like the US dollar that we take for granted.
So I think there's something to be said, particularly for someone who's afraid that they're going to get their internet cut off in a kind of graceful degradation. So I could say, I want to go full peer-to-peer. My entire system is going to have no master nodes. Everyone's just going to pass messages to phones that they can talk to directly. And it's going to be very difficult for me to search the entire world. So the person sitting in Virginia is going to have trouble knowing, okay, what's actually going on in Moscow today? But I could have a system set up where there are absolutely miners who are getting some kind of financial incentive for running big indexing jobs and enabling you to search the entire world, while simultaneously having a system that does this kind of peer-to-peer. So now I run a search, and if suddenly my internet's been cut off, the part of my search that was going to go contact the centralized database suddenly fails. And the part of the search that's only connected to, here are the phones that are connected to me and the phones that are connected to them and the phones that are connected to them, and the sort of transitive closure of people in the same city. Suddenly your network, instead of going from I'm talking to the world to I'm isolated, you go from I'm talking to the world to I'm talking to my city. And it may be a false dichotomy to say, do we need peers or do we need miners? Because most of the time, I don't want to run a search by talking to 1,000 phones that are near my phone. That's going to cost me battery and storage and CPU, and there are limited resources on my phone I don't want to burn. I'd much rather talk to one server who can just say, here's everything that's going on right now. But when I can't talk to that server, then fall back to the, okay, now I'm going to poll all my peers and participate in a gossip net and spread those messages around. I think there's something we said for graceful degradation plus accelerators versus specifically choosing only a centralized system or only a peer-to-peer system.
I really, really love this thought experiment. I want to take it to the slippery slope extreme. At that point where we're in that universe and we have both these systems cooperating, what happens when the big man or the government or whatever you label as your enemy comes in for that regulatory capture or for that regulatory capture or taxation capture? They're of course going to go to the biggest nodes because that's the weakest link. Then what?
My guess is that you'll see a balkanization of the network. You are going to have most phones who are subject to the tyranny of the defaults and have their software largely unconfigured. And whatever country they bought their phone in, it's going to be configured as, I don't show you any content from sources that are on the block list for that particular region. But there'll be a checkbox like, my phone only runs Android apps that are blessed by Google and put in the store. But there's a checkbox that says, I would like to sideload an app, and I do so at my own risk. I think you'll see systems that very much look like that of, oh, do you want to turn off the censorship of everything that's on the block list by your country? Are you sure? Type in this CAPTCHA. Okay, fine, now it's actually off and you can see that content. And most phones won't participate in those networks until there's enough people who are sufficiently motivated to say, you know what, I think I want to play by EU rules and not my local country's rules. So I'm just going to tell my phone that I belong to a different region.
I mean, I think you can look at what we've seen so far in the history of Bitcoin and Ethereum and these other networks. We haven't really seen an attack by a government that's been successful. There's definitely been attacks. I don't know where they have come from, but there have been, there have been maybe a couple of failures from some networks that are not really that widely used or known today. But I think kind of going by the history of what we've seen so far with some of these successful decentralized networks and understanding that even if 30 or 40% of the nodes are running in an infrastructure like AWS, which Ethereum is, I don't know the number, but it's some wild number. Even if 90% of the network went down, the network would still be up.
I don't think I'm worried about governments competing at the mining level, although due to nuclear energy yield, I do have a question there, but let's shelve that for another time. I have worry about the regulatory capture or the taxation capture. They just come out with a policy that says, oh, if you have Bitcoin, regardless of whether you're a miner or not, or whether we are a miner or not, you have to pay XYZ tax on that. And now the whole process of decentralization to protest or resist monopolization just gets captured by either Google as a gatekeeper and Apple as a gatekeeper with an app store, or by a government. So does history just repeat itself?
Yeah, I mean, this question is, relating to people that have their, I guess, financial information maybe publicly made available that might be, I guess, made vulnerable to those sorts of situations. But I think most of the people that I know are trying to abide by the rules and laws and regulations. I think the problem right now, at least at least in the networks that I'm talking to, has more to do with the lack of regulation versus the too much regulation. So if we don't know what the gray area is and where we're doing things that may or may not be going by the laws, or like what is the legal risk that we don't know that we're kind of crossing, I think that's the problem. We need more clear regulation versus less regulation. I don't think regulation is bad. Now, if you're kind of going to say, oh, one day, like 2 years from now, they're going to kind of pass this new law and they're going to say, okay, anyone that owns a governance token that's part of a DAO now has to pay capital gains on anything that they've received as ownership. That would definitely cause some disruption, but only for those people in that region. We're thinking that would be more on like a micro scale versus like a macro scale, whereas 99% of the network probably would not. I wouldn't say 99%, but let's say 80% would not even be affected by even the most, I guess, hardened regulatory approach that we might see from individual government. I mean, we saw China literally ban cryptocurrency and shut down every Bitcoin miner, and it did not really affect the networks. It may have shaken the market up here and there, but that's about it.
Yeah.
So I'd like to take a second and remind people who are listening that if you have a question that you would like to ask, you do have to request speaker before you'll be able to raise your hand with a question. I'm sorry, what were you saying, Mark?
Yeah, this per region balkanization, as you call it, I think for me is one of the most important thesis points, because we're already seeing the internet itself, just IP TCP connections get this type of fragmentation in different geographic zones. And that means the internet is not truly the internet. It becomes an intranet. It becomes a subnet. And the success of decentralization, or just the internet in general, I'm worried is going to lead back to this historical or political trend of balkanization, which could do more damage. Not that we shouldn't go for decentralization, but we need to be aware of that balkanization as it happens to try and build around it. Or else we might be off with an internet that is only US based, EU based, and you have to go through exchanges to talk between those two internets. That sounds depressing, but that's actual regulatory policy that's been proposed by many different countries.
I think that actually underscores the importance of having complete decentralization, because if you have a completely decentralized web infrastructure, then there is no middle person that can stop any of this stuff. So the reason that the internet is successful, like you mentioned, is because of these decentralized protocols: TCP, FTP, SSH, HTTP, whatever. I mean, if I build an application using HTTP, anyone in the world can access it without an intermediary, and like we can know it's just going to work. I mean, we have had all these primitives. I think the only thing that you're seeing now added to the mix over the last 10 years or so is having new primitives that we can just add to these existing primitives. We never had the ability to store value natively. So therefore we built massively complex financial infrastructure like PayPal that connects with Wells Fargo, and all of the code that to make that work and everything around it is just a complete disaster. I mean, it's a complete mess. If you ever try to send money from the United States to Palestine, you're going to just want to basically like rip your hair out. And if you've ever tried to receive money in Palestine from someone in the US, it's even worse. The ability to be able to just literally open your web browser, download a wallet, and receive a payment is revolutionary. And that's, the reason that we have that is because of decentralization. No one can stop that. So I think we need to look at every piece of the software stack and figure out how can we build out a decentralized version of this. Therefore, we can build out these hyper. You could think of them as a hyperstructure. Someone wrote a blog post that kind of called them that. They're just kind of like unbreakable components for us to build applications on.
And I do think it's worth keeping in mind that these networks grew not just because of protocols, but there were actual human efforts to get things connected. The US State Department did a lot of work to get universities in the EU and even Cuba to connect to NSFNet and start building out the internet as an international thing and get these protocols adopted internationally. It wasn't just that the protocols were good, there was real effort by NSF to make sure these things were adopted until, Senator Gore was like, NSF should not control this network. We need to make it independent from the US government. And then we switched from having universities on NSFNet to a commercial internet. And well, that seems to have worked out well.
And NSF slowly became NSA with the PRISM program. Thank you, Edward Snowden. All right, Bartholomew, you wanted to ask a question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Sure can. Go ahead.
Okay, so hi, I'm Bartek, and I'm just playing with GAN in my projects. But I had a pretty interesting question. It's not my question, but I'm curious of your answers. How this system based on cryptocurrencies and also what you mentioned earlier, that is promoting early birds, early adapters, will be efficient and will be better than the current one for people that are, let's say, 5 years now, and they had no chance to be early adapters. They will be lost in this whole process.
So I think the thing that obviously is being kind of like talked about here that you're interested in knowing maybe more about our thoughts around are the first mover advantage. So like if you bought Uber stock as a VC versus if you bought it today, you obviously would have gotten a better deal and you would have had a larger upside. And you're kind of speaking around a lot of the protocols that have tokens. And if you get in like quote unquote early, or if you're an early adopter or maybe even early builder, you have more upside. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah, in general, yeah. If you go into this this new Web3 right now, you can be a winner. But there's no, from my point of view, a big difference between what we have right now. I mean, the market that we have right now, with the market we will have 50 years ahead. If we will be focused on promoting just these early adapters.
Yeah, so I guess it depends like what you define as like getting in or what this ownership stake would kind of look like. So if you're a developer, well, let me just kind of speak from the perspective of a developer. If you learn how to write JavaScript today, you are going to find yourself getting a $100,000 a year job probably within 6 months to a year if you're like an intermediate level person. Now, if you had learned JavaScript like 20 years ago, you would have obviously, had the last, or however many years ago it was, you would have had all this time to kind of build up your reputation and your portfolio and your skills, and you would probably be making a lot more than that. In Web3, if you kind of come in early on a NFT project or a protocol and you get these tokens, you might get them at like 10 cents, and then maybe a year down the road, they would be worth $2. And then the people coming in at that point would be getting way less upside than you. And, like 2 or 3 years down the road, whatever happens, I guess you could say. So like for looking at it from the perspective of like tokens and stuff like that, yeah, that's definitely a part of it, I would say. But if you are really just interested in the general like positive ramifications that don't have anything to do with this, the thing that I'm really most interested in has to do with stable currencies and how they're being used in different parts of the world where they are dealing with like inflation and stuff like that. So like as a developer, I can build out financial applications that allow people to transact in these stable coins. And I can also get a job working somewhere or working on some type of project, regardless of if I get tokens or not. I can just get paid in US dollars and make money and have a living. If you are looking at it from the investment perspective, which you might be hinting at here, if you wanted to invest in Google back in the day, you were probably not even given a chance to do that in the first place, because you had to have been an accredited investor and have really, really great connections and all of that stuff. If you wanted to invest in, I don't know, any of the more recent startups like Stripe, Vercel, like all these companies are currently, or they have in the last 5 or 10 years, raised millions of dollars. But guess what? Me and you and the average person did not have the opportunity to kind of participate. In Web3, you're just seeing like the lowering of the barrier to entry to participate in these different quote unquote like investments. So yeah, there are opportunities to get in early. And if you are, I guess, knowledgeable about the ecosystem and you see a project, like for me, as a developer, I can probably spot a project that I think will be useful. I don't think there's anything wrong with people being able to kind of actually have the investments that were gate kept from them for the last 20 or 30 years. But I don't also think it's kind of a gatekeeping mechanism of itself, because even if you don't invest or anything like that in any of these protocols or projects, you can still benefit from them by being, I don't know, just a developer or a employee or a community member that is kind of like helping build this stuff. That's just my general thoughts about it.
Great. Well, thanks for the question, and let's go into closing statements. Aaron or Mark, would you like to start us off?
Why don't you go first, Mark?
Yeah. So for me, while I do think opportunity and upside is extremely important, it's most important in the non-first world countries and in the locations where there's the unbanked. And those people are just as susceptible to internet failures, to regulatory coercion, at a much higher degree than we in first world countries or United States or wherever it is have a right to our parliament or our democracy to try and stave off that type of big man regulatory control. And at the end of the day, as long as that bar is moving forward, which, as I've challenged on the talk today, I don't know if much beyond Bitcoin is needed for that, but Nadir has brought up many good points. I am gravely concerned that an investment-only mindset versus a getting in early as a miner or even getting in early as a peer will lead to a distortion that brings down regulatory hammer much faster versus just going for the utility without a token on its own. So that's kind of my summary thought.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my closing thoughts are, this has been a really great discussion. I think that when we talk about technologies, we tend to kind of like say this or that. Instead, I think we should say this is good for this and that is good for that. And we can kind of have discussions around the trade-offs between those different technologies. And there are technologies that are inferior or superior to others, that's for sure. But I think that a lot of times we get caught up in these comparisons. And I think the word Web2 in and of itself is almost sometimes problematic, because it sounds like we're replacing something when in reality we just have new ways to build things.
Yeah, I was going to make a similar point when it comes to discussions of, do we want fully peer-to-peer systems versus federated systems versus centralized systems, that we should always stop and think, okay, is this architecture useful? The real measure of a technology is, does it actually enable us to do something that we couldn't do before? HTTP was a great protocol and had very low adoption costs. Essentially, anyone could take their home computer, stand up an HTTP server, and now have a website on the internet. But it was very difficult to find anything. And then Google came around and indexed the entire web. And building that index was very expensive. And they can build a search engine because they have an index of the web. And you can't build a search engine because you don't have an index of the web. And you can't crawl the whole web on your home internet. you can easily stand up a website to run from your home. You will have a great deal of difficulty setting up a search engine to run from your home. As we build out these new Web3 protocols, I think it is important to keep in mind that there are things that work really well in peer-to-peer at the edge, and there's things that work very well at the center. And always keep thinking, how will this degrade? Will this thing simply die if I pull out the API? Is my app simply not exist if MetaMask is offline for an hour? Or do I fall back to some slower, less efficient way of answering the same question? And I just encourage people, think about what is actually useful and building systems that work together and more seamlessly shift from the model of we are a full peer-to-peer BitTorrent style transfer, or we are a full centralized YouTube style transfer. There is an entire spectrum in the middle that doesn't really match either of these, where we can most of the time download the video from nice, fast, close peers, except when that doesn't work, and then sure, why not? Pull it from the phone next to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all, and thank you to all these speakers. Certainly follow them and learn from them. We'll be hosting more of these talks. Please stay tuned. This is Robert Schwenker, and signing off for us all.